the course of our lectures is called English and American Literature, and now today's lecture is devoted to the Elizabethan period. In this period, William Shakespeare stands out as a poet and a playwright as yet unsurpassed. Shakespeare wrote plays in a variety of genres, including histories, tragedies, comedies, and late romances or tragicomedies. Shakespeare's career continues in the Jacobean period. Other important figures in Elizabethan theatre include Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson, Thomas Dekker, John Fletcher, and Francis Beaumont. As for the Jacobean period, in the early 17th century, Shakespeare wrote the so-called problem plays, as well as a number of his best-known tragedies, including Macbeth and King Lear. In his final period, Shakespeare turned to romance or tragicomedy and completed 3 more major plays, including The Tempest. Less bleak than the tragedies, these 4 plays are graver in tone than the comedies of the 1590s, but they end with reconciliation and forgiveness of potentially tragic errors. After Shakespeare's death, the poet and dramatist Ben Jonson was the leading literary figure of the Jacobean era. Jonson's aesthetic hark back to the Middle Ages, and his characters embodied the theory of humour, which was based on contemporary medical theory. Jonson's comedies include Walpole and Bartholomew Fair. Others who follow Jonson's style include Beaumont and Fletcher, who wrote the popular comedy The Knight of the Burning Pestle, a satire of the rising middle class. Another popular style of theatre during Jacobean times was the revenge play, which was popularized in the Elizabethan era by Thomas Kidd, and then further developed later by John Webster. The White Devil and the Duchess of Malfi. Other revenge tragedies include the Changeling, written by Thomas Middleton and William Rowley. Poetry. George Chapman is remembered chiefly for his famous translation of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey into English verse. This was the first ever complete translations of either poem in the English language. The translation had a profound influence on English literature and inspired John Keats' famous sonnet, On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. Shakespeare popularized the English sonnet, which made significant changes to Petrarch model, a collection by sonnets dealing with themes such as the passage of time, love, beauty, and morality, were first published in 1609. Besides Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, the major poets of the early 17th century include the metaphysical poets John Donne, George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, Andrew Marvell, and Richard Crashaw. Their style was characterized by wit and metaphysical conceits, that is, far-fetched or unusual similes or metaphors. Prose. The most important prose work of the early 17th century was the King James Bible. This, one of the most massive translation projects in the history of English up to this time, was started in 1604 and completed in 1611. This represents the culmination of a tradition of Bible translation into English that began with the work of William Tyndale, and it became the standard Bible of the Church of England. Restoration Age. Restoration literature includes both Paradise Lost and the Earl of Rochester Sodom, the comedy of the country wife, and the moral wisdom of Pilgrim's Progress. It saw Locke's two treatises on government, the founding of the Royal Society, the experiments and the holy meditations of Robert Boyle, the historical attacks on theatres from Jeremy Collier, the pioneering of literary criticism from Dryden, and the first newspapers. The official break in literary culture caused by censorship and radical moralist standards under Cromwell's Puritan regime created a gap in literary tradition, allowing a seemingly fresh start for all forms of literature after the Restoration. During the interregnum, the royalist forces attached to the court of Charles I went into exile with a 20-year-old Charles II. The nobility who traveled with Charles II were therefore lodged for over a decade in the midst of the continent's literary scene. Restoration Age poetry. John Milton, one of the greatest English poets, wrote at this time of religious flux and political upheaval. Milton, best known for his epic poem Paradise Lost. Among other important poems include the Allegro, Penserosa, Comas, a Mask, and Lucidas. Milton's poetry and prose reflect deep personal conviction, a passion for freedom and self-determination, and urgent issues and political turbulence of his day. His celebrated Areopagitica, written in condemnation of pre-publication censorship, is among history's most influential and impassioned defenses of free speech and freedom of the press. The largest and most important poetic form of the era was satire. In general, publication of satire was done anonymously, as there were great dangers in being associated with satire. John Dryden was an influential English poet, literary critic, translator, and playwright who dominated the literary life of Restoration England to such a point that the period came to be known in literary circles as the Age of Dryden. He established the heroic couplet as a standard form of English poetry. Dryden's greatest achievements were in satiric verse, in works like the mock heroic Mac known. Alexander Pope was heavily influenced by Dryden and often borrowed from him. Other writers in the 18th century were equally influenced by both Dryden and Pope. Restoration Age prose. Prose in the Restoration Age is dominated by Christian religious writing, but the Restoration also saw the beginnings of two genres that would dominate later periods: fiction and journalism. Religious writing often stayed into political and economic writing, such as political economic writing implied or directly addressed religion. The Restoration was also the time when John Locke wrote many of his philosophical works. His two treatises on government, which later inspired the thinkers in the American Revolution. The Restoration moderated most of the more strident sectarian writing, but radicalism persisted after the Restoration. Puritan authors such as John Milton were forced to retire from public life or adapt, and those authors who had preached against monarchy and who had participated directly in the regicide of Charles I were particularly suppressed. Consequently, violent writings were forced underground, and many of those who had served in the interregnum attenuated their positions in the Restoration. John Bunyan stands out beyond other religious authors of the period. Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory of personal salvation and a guide to the Christian life. During the Restoration period, the most common manner of getting news would have been a broadsheet publication. A single large sheet of paper might have a written, usually partisan account of an event. It is impossible to satisfactorily date the beginning of a novel in English. However, long fiction and fiction biographies began to distinguish themselves from other forms in England during the Restoration period. An existing tradition of romance fiction in France and Spain were popular in England. One of the most significant figures in the rise of the novel in the Restoration period is Aphra Behn, the author of Oroonoko, who was not only the first professional female novelist, but she may be among the first professional novelists of either sex in London. Restoration Age drama. As soon as the previous Puritan regim's ban on public stage representations was lifted, the drama recreated itself quickly and abundantly. The most famous plays of the early Restoration period are the unsentimental hot comedies of John Dryden, William Wycherley, George Etheridge, which reflect the atmosphere at court and celebrate an aristocratic macho lifestyle of unremitting sexual intrigue and conquest. After a sharp drop in both quality and quantity of the 1680s, the mid-1690s saw a brief second flowering of the drama, especially comedy. Comedies like William Congreve's The Way of the World and John Van Brand, the relapse and the provoked wife, were softer and more middle class in ethos, very different from the aristocratic extravaganza 20 years earlier and aimed at a wider audience. Literary of the 18th century reflected the worldview of the Age of Enlightenment, Age of Reason, a rational and scientific approach to religious, social, political, and economic issues that promoted a circular view of the world and a general sense of progress and perfectibility, led by the philosophers who were inspired by the discoveries of the previous century by people like Isaac Newton and the writings of Descartes, John Locke, Francis Bacon. They sought to discover and to act upon universally valid principles governing humanity, nature, society. They variously attacked spiritual and scientific authority, dogmatism, intolerance, censorship, and economic and social restraints. They considered the state the proper and rational instrument of progress. The extreme rationalism and skepticism of the age led naturally to deism and also played a part in bringing the later reaction of romanticism. The encyclopedia of Denis Diderot epitomized the spirit of the age. The term Augustan literature derives from authors of the 1720s and the 1730s themselves, who responded to a term that George I of England preferred for himself. While George I meant the title to reflect his mind, they instead saw in it a reflection of ancient Rome's transition from rough and ready literature to highly political and highly polished literature. It is an age of exuberance and scandal, age of enormous energy and inventiveness and outrage that reflected an era when English, Scottish, and Irish people found themselves in the midst of an expanding economy, lowering barriers to education, and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Literary of the 18th century poetry. It was during this time that poet James Thomson produced his melancholy The Seasons, and Edward Young wrote his poem Night Thoughts. Though the most understanding poet of the age is Alexander Pope, it is also the era that saw the serious competition of the proper model for the pastoral. In criticism, poets struggled with the doctrine of decorum, of matching proper words with proper sense, and of achieving a diction that matched the gravity of a subject. At the same time, the mock heroic was at its zenith, and Pope's Rape of the Loco and the Dunciad are still the greatest mock heroic poems ever written. Pope also translated the Iliad and the Odyssey, and since his death, Pope has been in a constant state of re-evaluation. Literature of the 18th century and drama. Drama in the early part of the period featured the last plays of John Vanbrugh and William Congreve, both of whom carried on the Restoration comedy with some alterations. However, the majority of stagings were of low farces and much more serious and domestic tragedies. George Lillo and Richard Steele both produced highly moral forms of tragedy, where the characters and the concerns of the characters were wholly middle class or working class. This reflected a marked change in the audience for plays, as royal patronage was no longer the important part of theatrical success. Additionally, Coley Seabar and John Rich began to battle each other for greater and greater spectacles to present on stage. The figure of Harlequin was